My review of Ace Audits' visit to a freight terminal brought an abusive backlash from auditors. However, a YouTube auditor called Banaman gave a more considered, but still wrong, response in the comments section beneath the video. His contribution is important because he gives us the auditing community's views on the law, and here is my reply. The comment beneath that video is still up, by the way. I've pinned it so you can go and look at it yourself if you want. What I'm going to do is show you what Banaman said, and I will then give my response to show you why he's wrong. I'm then going to talk a little bit about Banaman himself, my thoughts about him and his channel. I won't be attacking him too harshly, I don't think, because to give him credit, he hasn't insulted me or abused me. He stuck to his argument, which is what I want to see from people who come on my channel to disagree with me. I think he's completely wrong, but to give him credit, at least he does try to make an argument. Let's go into what he says. This is his response, remember, to my video about Ace Audits. To fully understand what I'm about to go into, it's best to watch the previous video first. I've left a link in the description so you can go and watch that and then come to this if you haven't seen it already. Just to quickly recap, in that video I made the following points about Ace Audits: that she did not understand Section 33, her understanding of Section 33 is nonsense, Section 33 has nothing to do with access to private land. In the video I explain why. She was committing trespass, intentionally so. She was committing aggravated trespass. She was poking around commercial yards, clearly trying to provoke a reaction. She was telling lies to everybody about what she was doing and why. She was wearing a mask while she did all this. She ignored her duties under data protection. She acted condescendingly towards a security guard because he was foreign and she clearly thought he was dumb, but he was actually correct in virtually everything he said. The only bit he got wrong was about flying the drone over the premises, but even then you could argue he was right in the sense that given her behaviour, flying the drone was just further provocation and amounted to a Section 5 public order offence. She was probably flouting drone regulations anyway, in that she probably did not keep to visual line of sight, and if so, that is a further criminal offence. She was, in my view, generally acting like a complete prat. I could put it stronger. The more I see of these visits by various auditors, the more convinced I am that it is essentially just criminal and pseudo-criminal behaviour. Anyway, let's get into Banaman's response to all this. The first thing he says is, you appear to be able to dish it, but can you also take it? My answer to that point is yes and no. I can take well-founded criticism because that helps me. I don't mind a free education, but I'm also human just like the rest of you. I can't take insults and abuse, and I will ban anybody who directs that at me. I put the hours in to make my videos and I research everything carefully, and I do try to be fair and balanced. If I think an auditor is in the right, I will definitely make a point of saying so. Given all of this, you can perhaps understand that when the criticism takes the form of disguised abuse, I'm going to give it short shrift. Banaman then states this: Public Order Act 1986, Section 16, subsection B, public place means any place to which at the material time the public or any section of the public has access on payment or otherwise, as of right or by virtue of express or implied permission. That is correct. I should add for completeness that there is a subsection A in Section 16 which adds reference to highways in that definition, but that's not terribly important here. But I didn't mention Section 16 in the video about Ace Audits because that's not what Ace Audits mentioned herself. She relied on Section 33 of the Criminal Justice Act 1972. Why are we mentioning Section 16? Section 33 states this: for the definition of public place in Section 9.1 of the Public Order Act 1936, there shall be substituted, public place includes any highway or other premises or place to which at the material time the public have or are permitted to have access, whether on payment or otherwise. You'll see straight away 2 points. First, the wording of Section 16 is completely different to Section 33. Section 16 refers to the public or any section of the public, and access as of right or by virtue of express or implied permission. Section 33 does not include that. Second, notice the crucial context in Section 33 that this serves as a definition for the Public Order Act 1936. If you've watched a previous video, you'll know that the Public Order Act 1936 has nothing to do with access to land. Similarly, if we look at Section 16 of the Public Order Act 1986, what we see is that Banaman has not been entirely honest with us. What Section 16 actually says is, in this part, public place means, that's how it begins. What that is telling us is that the definition of public place in Section 16 applies to Part 2 of the Public Order Act 1986. If we take a look at Part 2, we can see that it concerns how the police regulate public processions, mainly political demonstrations that take the form of marches and protests, and also assemblies, which would be static demonstrations. That means just as Section 33 has nothing to do with access to private land, Section 16 has nothing to do with it either. Banaman goes on to say, "Your opinion based on the definition of a public space is not correct according to legislation!" Example copied here for quick references for a reasonable comprehension as to what the auditor said. I assume he means by my opinion, my dismissal of Ace Audits' use of Section 33, so why is he bringing up Section 16, which was never mentioned in the first place? Is it because he thinks Section 16 will be more helpful to his case somehow? In any event, my view of the relevance of Section 33, or indeed Section 16, has nothing at all to do with the definition of a public space or public place. He's getting the terminology confused, I think. I assume by public space he means to use the terminology in Section 16 and Section 33, which is public place. The point Banaman is missing is that these definitions are not for general purposes. They expressly apply for the purpose of the relevant statutes that they are contained in, and the definitions are not even uniform. Even if they were uniform, and we could say there is a model definition of public place that is used by the legislature, a model definition is still not a general definition. The two things stand in contradiction. If a definition was for general use, we wouldn't need a model definition. We wouldn't need all these different acts of parliament with a definition in them. We would just have one statute or one bit of current determining case law that defines public place for general purposes. We don't have that. There is, let me repeat, no general all-purpose definition of public place. To deem one of these definitions as a general definition, you'd first have to decide whether it's Section 33 or Section 16 or some other section or some other act that defines public place. So that means you're ignoring all the other ones in favour of just one of them. And assuming we can decide which one applies, then you've got to decide when it should override all the other definitions. Which is nonsensical, because why do we need the other definitions? It's clear and obvious that the definitions are tailored to specific types of situations, and case law then evolves how those statutory definitions are applied in certain situations. But the really important point is this. Even if I've got all this wrong and one of these definitions, Section 16 or Section 33, is a general all-purpose definition, it doesn't help Banaman's argument anyway, as I will explain. But first, back to Banaman. Breaking it down as stated, he's going to break down the definition in Section 16. He thinks I can't read, so he's helping me out. Thanks a lot. Here is how he presents his breakdown. The wording of the statutory definition is in yellow and his comments are in green. The problem here is that you can't understand it all by breaking it down like that. You have to read it through. If we just stick to the parts in yellow, let's read it through again. But I'm going to add the bits he's missed out. They're in white. In this part, public place means any highway, or in Scotland, any road within the meaning of the Roads Scotland Act 1984, and any place to which at the material time the public or any section of the public has access on payment or otherwise, as of right or by virtue of express or implied permission. We can miss out the bit about Scotland because we're not in Scotland, so let's take that out and see what we're left with. What I would ask you to focus on there are the phrases as of right and by virtue of express or implied permission. What they tell us is that for somewhere to be a public place, according to this, for the purposes of the 1986 Act, it has to be accessed by right or by permission. By right or by permission. Permission can be express or implied. Now let's go back over what he says about this in relation to Ace Audits. So now we're going back to the comments in green, but we're collecting them together. The auditor is in a place deemed as any place as she has correctly identified. The auditor never paid to get to the place within the area she visited, and therefore would be reasonable to deem that she arrived at those locations as described within the description identified as otherwise. The auditor believed she had an implied permission to enter since the gates were obviously open. You can see that he's correct in his first 2 points, or at least broadly correct, without wanting to quibble. The whole thing rests on the last point. That's where his argument unravels. He's telling us that the auditor believed she had an implied permission to enter since the gates were obviously open. That means he's admitting she didn't have a right to be there. She's relying on permission, and I agree with him on that. But I disagree that she had implied permission. She did not have implied permission, and you can see for yourself that she didn't by looking at this photograph of what was in front of her. You can see the security point. She was supposed to report to the security point. By not doing so, she immediately became a trespasser as soon as she stepped onto the terminal. It's very simple, that's the law. Just to emphasise to you that I'm not being biased against auditors here, and people who watch my videos regularly will know this because I always, and I mean always, try to give maximum latitude to the auditor when it comes to having implied permission to access. I always try to give the benefit of the doubt to the auditor. Always. And I usually say that when an auditor turns up on private land, he should have an implied permission to be there to film. I don't really believe he does have the implied permission. It's a fiction I'm engaging in, but I'm engaging in that fiction because I want to ensure that my channel is balanced. In the case of Ace Audits, I can't give her the benefit of the doubt because there's a security point. It is impossible to say that she had implied permission. It would amount to not just a charitable fiction, but an outright lie. What all this means is that Banaman is simply talking nonsense in regard to Ace Audits. But does it also mean that other auditors could avail themselves of Section 16 or indeed Section 33? Well, no, it doesn't, for the following reasons. First, Section 16 and Section 33 don't have anything to do with access to private land anyway, as I've explained. They are definition clauses for statutes that regulate political activity. Second, if we really think about it, if lawful access depends on permission, then why and how would Section 16 or Section 33 help or be at all relevant? You either have permission or you don't. If you do have permission, what do you need Section 16 or Section 33 for? They're superfluous. If you don't have permission, then Section 16 and Section 33 don't apply anyway because they depend on permission. As if to reinforce that point with regard to Section 16, the 1986 Public Order Act contains a section on trespassory assembly. That's Section 14A, which is saying that where a public assembly is not in a place for which the participants have a right or permission from the landowner, the police can obtain an order prohibiting it as a trespassory assembly. To reiterate, the whole point of Section 16 is to say that a place is a public place for the purpose of processions and assemblies where there is a right or permission to be there. Similarly, Section 33, the whole point of that is to define public place where there is a right or permission to be there. Neither Section 16 nor Section 33 are operative clauses. They are just definitions. They don't act as permissions in and of themselves, but they depend on permissions or rights existing already to have meaning. They just define terms used elsewhere in the statutes in which they are contained, and the operative clauses of those statutes, let me repeat, have nothing to do with access to land anyway. The truth is that auditors don't actually need Section 33 or Section 16. They don't add anything to the picture in any case. They don't confer any rights or permissions to auditors. Section 33 and Section 16 are not about public access because Section 33 and Section 16 assume public access as a predicate. If you turn up somewhere and say, I can access here because of section 33, what you're effectively saying, if we follow your own logic, is that you have permission to have permission. You're talking double Dutch. The confusion is resolved by actually reading what section 33 and indeed section 16 actually say, and recognising that, as I've already said, these are interpretation clauses for legislation that has nothing to do with public access to private land. What section 33 and section 16 set out to do is define a public place for the purpose of ensuring that a ban on political uniforms can be enforced in the case of section 33, and for regulating public processions and public assemblies in the case of section 16. I can't think of any other way of putting this across, short of putting out a semaphore message or sending it by pigeon. You either get it or you don't. If you're still confused, you could try playing my explanation back and stopping and pausing it to take in what I'm saying. You can also ask me questions under the video. As long as your questions are genuine, I really don't mind, and despite what I've just said, you shouldn't be embarrassed about not understanding it, because it may be new to you and there are things that we all don't understand. The bottom line is that section 33 is being interpreted incorrectly, and in any case it's not required and will be ineffective even on the terms by which auditors define it. Let's go back to Banaman. He says, this is the interpretation from the Public Order Act that describes what a public space is, albeit in the form of an extension of a public... the punctuation, there's no punctuation in here, so it does make it difficult to read. I'll start again. This is the interpretation from the Public Order Act that describes what a public space is, albeit in the form of an extension of a public space onto private property or land, as per described in the breakdown of section B. He's referring here to section 16 still, and what he says there is correct. As Banaman correctly states, section 16 does extend the definition of public space to certain forms of private land, but this is for the purpose of public processions and public assemblies, and the definition of public space has nothing to do with access to private land anyway. You either have right or permission to access or you don't. Section 16 and section 33 don't add anything, so none of this changes anything I've said. Banaman goes on to say, the Criminal Justice Act 1972 section 33 means the same thing. The grammar and punctuation is his own. He means that section 33 and section 16 mean the same thing. He's wrong. They don't. This shows that he hasn't actually read it. I mean really read it. There's a difference between reading words on a page and reading something in the sense of comprehending it. Section 33 actually does not mean the same thing as section 16. It means something different. If you don't believe me, just read it yourself. Just read what section 16 and section 33 actually say and compare them, and you'll see I'm right. The purpose of the two clauses differs because the statutes differ and the wording of the definitions differ very significantly. I've literally shown you on the screen how they differ. Banaman says, the auditor was correct to claim she is a member of the public irrespective of her intentions. That's irrelevant. The general public do not have implied permission to access Manchester Freight Terminal. Then he says, the auditor may have pre-knowledge regarding the fact that she would be creating content for her YouTube channel. That is irrelevant at this point and no one else's business but her own, because there is nobody there to ask her about it and who she wants to share that knowledge with. Again, that's irrelevant because the public don't have implied permission to access Manchester Freight Terminal anyway, so no argument about reasonable expectation arises. As for, he goes on, as for your analysis and up to time point 1606, I pause your video to share my own views regarding her own presumed implied right of access based on an open gate, which can very easily also be deemed as an invite to come in, maybe is something you could reflect on! Exclamation mark. An open gate is not an invite to come in. She was trespassing from the start. That's what the law says about this. It's not my fault, I'm just telling you what the law is. He then goes on, I've not identified in my own opinion that the auditor has trespassed at this point in time because her own perceived implied access invitation at this point is identified by the open gates, and nobody or sign appeared to inform the auditor she is trespassing at any time. What he says there could only be correct if there was an implied permission to enter. There wasn't. The open gate and lack of specific signage is irrelevant because there was a security point, which means she only had an implied permission to report to security. She was trespassing when she decided to walk in without reporting to security. He goes on, now that there are some people engaged in conversation with her and justifiably questioning the auditor as to why she's there, it is indeed a reasonable expectation at this point to ask questions. The auditor then proceeds to provide information that is also correct, and she is indeed just a member of the public irrespective of why she's there. I was rapidly losing respect for this Banaman person as I read this part of his response. Ace Audits clearly lied. She lied directly and also by omission. She made herself out to be a hobbyist and just a member of the public. That's a lie. That means Banaman is also lying. I'm sorry, I don't want to be insulting, but I think it's really stupid to lie like this. You're basically telling barefaced lies in front of everybody. You're basically calling us all stupid. You're lying and you just don't care because you think we're all stupid. That's what this boils down to. Then goes on, GDPR is an expectation for the company or companies in this matter to protect their employees, etc. regarding GDPR breaches. If the auditor is claiming to be just a member of the public, I am obliged to inform you that GDPR only applies to businesses. You covered the elements of journalism, and that was a good point you made up to time point. Bear in mind here that I'm not correcting his grammar or syntax because I want to ensure that I'm not accidentally misrepresenting anything he said. The standard of English usage of these people is typically poor, and that is a relevant factor in his misunderstanding, I think. The law is basically a book-based subject. You have to read it. If you're in this dangerous business of trying to stay 1 inch within the law, then as well as being of slightly dubious morals, you also need to be quite bright, and you need to be able to read and write to quite an advanced level to grasp what you're doing. But I'm getting slightly off track. Back to what he says. Like most auditors, he doesn't understand the law at all. He doesn't understand the basics of trespass, and he doesn't understand data protection. And like most auditors, he seems absolutely certain of what he says, even though what he says is incorrect, and shows a catastrophic misunderstanding of a relevant law. And like all auditors, he simply will not listen to people like me who are knowledgeable and experienced. Let me explain again. Recital 18 of the UK GDPR exempts data processing for personal or household purposes from virtually all data protection, while Article 418 of the UK GDPR defines an enterprise as follows. Enterprise means a natural or legal person engaged in an economic activity, irrespective of its legal form, including partnerships or associations regularly engaged in an economic activity. Ace Audits has a monetized YouTube channel, so she is engaged in an economic activity, in this case as a sole trader, or she may be in partnership with somebody, or she may even own the channel through a company. Whatever the legal arrangement is that she has, her channel is a business for the purpose of data protection, and she is a data controller. Or if her company is the data controller, assuming she has a company, she is presumably an officer of that company, so she is de facto in the position of a data controller. That means she is required to provide the information under Article 13.1 of the UK GDPR, which I list here, and also she is required under Article 13.2 to inform data subjects of their other rights, which I show here. Article 4 defines personal data as data that could identify a natural person, and that definition does apply to facial images when captured in a context such as a home or workplace. The reality of the situation is this. Ace Audits entered site without reporting to security. She behaved on that site in a deliberately suspicious manner by wearing a mask and poking around business premises, looking at crates and pallets and whatnot. She filmed herself doing this. She did this to provoke a reaction because she knew the business occupiers would have to confront her. She was recording these people's faces. Even Banaman concedes that their inquiries of her were reasonable. She wasn't truthful with them or with security about what she was doing. In fact, she lied. So these people would not necessarily have understood that their faces would be broadcast on social media in a way that could embarrass them or cause them distress, which is quite apart from any distress or alarm they may have been caused and were evidently caused by her presence on the day due to her own behaviour. In doing all this, she was processing personal data in breach of the requirements in the UK GDPR, and she is not registered as a data controller despite the fact that her activities require her to be so registered. Banaman then goes on to say something else about Section 33. I don't know why his reply to me is all mixed up like this. You also stated that the information is for the interpretation of public space by the Public Order Act 1936 regarding the wearing of uniforms. What you will find that although it does make specific reference to the definition of a public space and to the wearing of uniforms, it also helps to identify that the area is also deemed as an extension of a public space via open gates. Again, he's just repeating something he has already said, which is wrong. Open gates don't give you immunity from trespass law. Trespass is trespass. It doesn't matter if you've got the morals of a Catholic priest and you've accidentally stumbled onto private land on the way back from Friday Mass while carrying Christmas presents for sick kids. You're still trespassing as a general principle. Sorry, that's the law. It's not my fault. I didn't decide the law. I'm just telling you what the law is. It then goes on to say, these are deemed technical points in law, and although you might have come to your analysis on what is happening here, there is no reason to believe that the auditor has done anything unlawful or illegal apart from now finding out that she should not be where she is at the time of her first verbal interactions! ! Again, that seems contradictory to me. Either she's trespassing or she isn't. There isn't a pregnant phase where you're only half trespassing. She was trespassing. I think it's obvious she was doing so intentionally. A point for you to reflect on, he goes on, is that the word used in legislation, namely otherwise, means in respect apart from that mentioned, or in other words, circumstances different from those present or considered! Otherwise is a word you appear to be miscomprehending in your analysis, and it forms part of the context for interpretation of the section you're misquoting! The word otherwise has nothing to do with it. The phrase on payment or otherwise, which you see here both in section 16 and section 33, just means that access could be obtained on payment or without payment for the purpose of defining public place for the purpose of that legislation. Banaman is just trying to divert us with verbose nonsense. She was trespassing. I'm never convinced anyway by somebody who can't spell simple words. In this case, it's quite amusingly ironic that he can't spell the word miscomprehending while trying to suggest that I have miscomprehended something. As I said about London Audits and I've said about Marty Bladborough, I will also say about Banaman, and I say this with due respect. If someone can't spell simple words or struggles with grammar and reading, that does not instill confidence that he can understand the law, because the law, after all, is in written form. It's a book-based subject. It's a library subject. What he says next doesn't add anything, so we'll skip it. Then he goes on to say, this is still a security issue that needs addressing because the auditor is making great points regarding the serious lack of security protocol. I agree with this. One thing that did come out of a video that sometimes comes out of auditing visits is that there are shortcomings in security, and I mentioned this myself in my own video. Then he says, gives me an order now, you should stop focusing on uniforms and the reference of them because it's only a point of definition that is established and can be drawn upon as a point of reference in definition irrespective of uniforms! Public Order Act 1986 section 16, have a read, it means the same for public space definition. I don't understand what he's raving about there. I referred to section 33 in the video because that's what Ace Audits refers to. There was no mention of section 16 by Ace Audits. Section 33 is a definition for the Public Order Act 1936, and section 1 of the 1936 Act prohibits the wearing of political uniforms in public places, hence the need to define public place. That's it. Similarly, as I've explained, section 16 concerns the regulation of processions and assemblies in public places, hence the need to define public place. The two definitions in section 16 and section 33 respectively are different. What else is there to say? Section 16 and section 33 have nothing to do with access to land, and they don't help auditors anyway because the wording of section 16 and section 33 clearly includes reference to the need for a right or permission. They don't add anything. Banaman simply doesn't understand what he's reading and hasn't thought it through. He then says, the auditor made a valid point that if the gates are open, public can gain access! Why do you have a problem with her statement? The public cannot lawfully access a freight terminal just because a gate is open. That's because there is a security point there. This man simply doesn't understand trespass law. If there wasn't a security point there, we would then be addressing whether she had implied permission, but we don't need to address that here. She should have obtained express permission from security, and she had implied permission to go on the land for the purpose of reporting to security, and that's it. Then he says, think about this one statement for a second. If the gates are open, any person can just walk in. Fact. It is irrelevant if she has permission or not. She proved it by just walking in as a member of the public and also complements the word in legislation expressed as otherwise. It doesn't matter what she can and cannot do in a physical sense here because there is manned security at the access and egress point. In terms of law, you can't just walk in because the gate's open. She's trespassing if she does so for any purpose other than to report to security, which should and could have been done immediately. He then goes on to say, the auditor then proceeded to state to the people, if you asked me to leave, I will leave. Sorry, if you ask me to leave, I will leave. That's true, and it's also nonsense because she knows full well, and Banaman knows full well, that she could have reported to security first, and she did not do so because she knew that access would be refused and she would not get the content. He then says, I managed to reach up to the time point 2940 where the auditor claimed responsibility for her own health and safety. And then the video changed to occupier's liability, and yes, I agree that with that section that the occupier's liability is a liability and have a duty of care, even towards criminals stealing from their site. ! I did not have enough time to analyse your analysis of the auditor in this video any further, so I will conclude at time point 2954. What that means is that he has posted this massive lengthy comment on my channel without watching the full video, which I think is a bit disrespectful and unfair. He does later in my exchange with him claim that he did later watch the whole thing. I will take him on trust and will say he did. Then he goes on to say, my simple conclusion here, unfortunately you have left holes in your analysis, and therefore if you believe you have the reasonable assumption to call the auditor's friendly approach as nonsense, then you need to look in the mirror. The auditor identified a serious security risk and she did them a favour. GDPR only applies to business, and it is a business responsibility to protest their data, etc. All they needed to do was ask her to leave irrespective of your analysis because the auditor did not do anything wrong. That just repeats points we've already covered. He's wrong about it all. Your point, then he goes on to say, your point about staff needing to gain entry at a security level is mute. Reason for mute is because there are such barrier systems that can operate via electronic tag. I think he means moot, not mute. I'm not sure what point of mine he is referring to, because it seems obvious to me that staff will not report to security and security would not expect them to, but security might come out and challenge somebody they don't recognise. They should have stopped Ace Audits, but the responsibility was on Ace Audits, who knew she was entering private land. Bear in mind, these are not my points, or not just my points. These are points made by the business occupiers who confronted Ace Audits, not because she was a stranger, but due to her behaviour on site. Then he says this, your point about the wearing of high-vis on this particular site is also mute in this video due to the fact the sign at the entrance stated this is mandatory by the blue mandatory sign, and the business representative acknowledged a health and safety issue as part of their concern. All blue safety signs are classed as mandatory, not optional as you wrongly stated. It wasn't my point about high-vis, it was a point made by one of the business owners who was concerned for Ace Audit's safety, or to be more precise, concerned that she would have to pay the price for Ace Audit's irresponsibility. Again, he uses the word mute when I think he means moot. He's also not, I'm not sure he's using the word moot correctly either, because health and safety isn't a moot point, and his own comment here demonstrates it, because he says that personal protective equipment was referred to on the notice board. So why didn't Ace Audits wear any? Why didn't she report to security, that being the case? Surely a requirement to report to security is implied by all the circumstances we're describing, by the layout of the access and egress point, and by the content of the signage. Why didn't she report to security? What is your answer to that, Banaman? Moving on to the next part of his point, I did not state in the video that blue safety signs are optional. I know that they are mandatory. I know because I've worked on industrial sites. I think what he might mean is that at some point I say that wearing high-vis is optional, which it is. It is a matter of policy for the landowner and for the business. There's no overarching general law that requires the wearing of high-vis specifically. It's not a criminal offence to fail to wear high-vis clothing, which is just as well for Ace Audits, perhaps. Although at one point we did get a glimpse of her, what looks like a coat, and it did look like a high-vis jacket, so it is a little bit confusing. Anyway, to explain how I come to the conclusion that high-vis jackets, high-vis clothing, isn't a criminal offence and isn't actually legally mandatory, we need to look at the sign Banaman is referring to and also the law. Contrary to what Banaman says, there is no mandatory sign at the entrance. There are two signs at the entrance, and at least one of them shows an instruction to wear high-vis, but that is not a mandatory sign despite the wording and format of it. The reason we know it's not a mandatory sign is because of paragraph 3.3 part 2 schedule 1 of the Health and Safety Signs and Signals Regulations 1996. That states what the intrinsic features are of a mandatory sign. The intrinsic features include that it shall be a round shape, and it is a round shape, or be printed on a larger board, but that will do. But if you scroll down paragraph 3 in that part of the regulations, you will see that high-vis signs are not a listed signboard under mandatory signs. What that means is that the high-vis sign Banaman is referring to is not strictly a mandatory sign under the regulations. You could argue, in fairness, and I would certainly agree with this, that the high-vis signs that we see there still make wearing high-vis on site mandatory along the private road by virtue of contract, and the sign clearly complies with the requirement, the intrinsic features required in the regulation anyway, and so it's a contractual obligation for people using the road. And I assume that one purpose of having security there is to check that people are wearing high-vis clothing, but that's entirely separate to the policies of individual owners, and so the sign is not so much a mandatory instruction as a warning of a potential for a finding of contributory fault in the event of personal injury is suffered by anyone, be it a visitor or staff member, and the cause of that injury can be attributed in whole or in part to not wearing a high vis. Because it wouldn't be possible for the landowner to completely enforce that, certainly not on the premises of business occupiers. Wouldn't be possible to enforce it in practical terms anyway. So in the case of employers, mandatory in this context means it's policy. So it's something you should do, and you could be dismissed by the employer for not doing it, and people often are. Often it will be treated as gross misconduct and therefore an instant dismissal if you stray from a mandatory policy without reason. But it doesn't typically follow that failing to adhere to a mandatory sign means you're breaking the law as such. In most cases it won't mean that, and it doesn't mean that here. The next bit is my favourite of the whole post from Banaman. He says, "You do not appear to know what trespass means. Trespass basically means to enter someone's land or property without permission. Your assumptions are just assumptions, and until the auditor has been informed they are trespassing, they are not typically automatically deemed trespassing like you were wrongly suggesting." I love how he says, "I do not appear to know what trespass means," then he gives a definition of trespass that's wrong. The trespass is the unlawful interference in land of another. A lawyer might quibble over that definition of mine, but only in terms of the exact wording. I've captured in that concise definition what trespass is. As I explained in a recent review video, I forget which one now, the word interference is used here in a technical sense rather than a dictionary sense. It means any sort of occupation or use of a land, ranging from at one end of the extreme, squatting on it, to walking your dog on it, to just stepping on it by a single inch. All those things and more are trespass, and intent is not a requirement. Trespass can be accidental. The interference has to be unlawful though. That means either that you do not have a right to be there or you don't have permission to be there. In this case, Ace Audits had no right or permission to be there, as I've demonstrated. That means she is automatically deemed to be trespassing. Whether you or I like it or not, that is the law. The business representatives should not be telling people that one of their pallets are worth thousands of pounds, Banaman says. They also need to brush up on their own security and GDPR and stop telling members of the public that what their stock is worth. The business representatives were caught unawares and didn't know that Ace Audits was going to broadcast their faces to thousands of people on social media. That's because she lied to them. I saw no breaches of data protection by anyone captured in Ace Audits footage. The only person who breaches data protection in that footage is Ace Audits herself. Then Banaman says, "What I draw from the auditor's video is that all they need to do is man the gates and process people visiting the site. That way they can leave their shutters open to low wagons like they stated in the video." Well, they do man the gate. Ace Audits ignored the security point and walked in. You may think she was doing them a favour, but she was still trespassing. He then says, "What I also draw from your video is that you have a problem with auditors, and your problem appears to be coming across with a muddy comprehension of what you assumed from this auditor's visit to this site." I don't quite know what he means by muddy comprehension now I think about it, but anyway, I do have a problem with auditors. They are breaking the law, the criminal law, and trampling on the rights of others. My comprehension is not muddy, it's very clear. It's clear to me that you, Banaman, are the one with the miscomprehension of the law. Then he says, thank you for your analysis, it's good to share opinions. Well, for me, this has not been good, and I can't thank you really, because this has taken up a considerable amount of my time for which I gain nothing. You've basically wasted my time with this a bunch of nonsense because you refuse to learn the subject. I have to reply to you though because you are spreading misinformation. There are further comments from both him and me beneath that comment of his, and some of his follow-up comments were lengthy as well. Here is one of my early comments to him in response, in which I remind him that everything is explained in the video. This video you're watching now is just me repeating it with perhaps a bit more technical depth. He seems to think that what I say is just my opinion, but it's not. I'm simply explaining what the law is. It's not my fault that he doesn't like what the law says. I haven't said that I like the law. It doesn't matter whether I like it or not. My personal opinions about the law of trespass and data protection and anything else are irrelevant to this. My opinions are no more relevant than the ravings of a washerwoman. All I'm doing is telling you what the law says. Perhaps a lawyer who specialises in these areas or some other knowledgeable person would quibble with me on some of the finer points and details, but let me repeat, what I'm telling you is what the law is. I don't have an opinion about it. Now that I've reflected on what Banaman asked me to reflect on, and I've answered him and shown his arguments to be completely wrong, I'd like Banaman to reflect on what I'm going to say next. Banaman is not harmless. The type who just indulges in rants and nobody particularly listens to, that's not him. He's doing harm. He's what I would call an enabler. He's not only lending pseudo-intellectual force to auditing. If you look at his channel, you will quickly realise that he's also giving support to other dubious pseudo-legal causes, such as Freeman on the land ideas, schemes that involve telling people they don't have to pay their utility bills or mortgages due to common law. This will do harm. People who follow these ideas will lose their homes, cash and possessions. What I'd like Banaman to reflect on is a judgment from Alberta, Canada. The judgment I'm now going to read from was handed down in the 2012 case of Meads and Meads, and the judgment was written by the Associate Chief Justice of Alberta, one J.D. Rook. Associate Chief Justice Rook referred to what he called organised pseudo-legal commercial arguments, or OPCAs for short, and he had this to say. When reduced to their conceptual core, most OPCA concepts are contemptibly stupid. Mr. Meads, for example, has presented the court with documents that appear to be a contract between himself and himself. One Mr. Meads promises to pay for any liability of the other Mr. Meads. One owns all property, the other all debts. What is the difference between these entities? One spells his name with uppercase letters, the other adds spurious and meaningless punctuation to his name. Mr. Meads with punctuation is the Mr. Meads who appeared in court. He says the Mr. Meads all capitals is the one who should pay child and spousal support. So where is that Mr. Meads all capitals? At one point in the June 8th hearing, Mr. Meads said that Mr. Meads all capitals was a corporate entity attached to his birth certificate. Later he told me that the other Mr. Meads was a person and that I had created him! Exclamation mark. Again, total nonsense. The bluntly idiotic substance of Mr. Meads' argument explains the unnecessarily complicated manner in which it was presented. OPCA arguments are never sold to their customers as simple ideas, but instead are Byzantine schemes which more closely resemble the plot of a dark fantasy novel than anything else. Latin maxims and powerful-sounding language are often used. Documents are often ornamented with many strange marking and seals. Litigants engage in peculiar ritual-like in-court conduct. All these features appear necessary for gurus to market OPCA schemes to their often desperate, ill-informed, mentally disturbed or legally abusive customers. This is crucial to understand the non-substance of any OPCA concept or strategy. The story and process of an OPCA scheme is not intended to impress or convince the courts, but rather to impress the guru's customer. Medieval alchemy is a helpful analogue. Alchemists sold their services based on the theatre of their activities rather than demonstrated results or any analytical or systematic methodology. OPCA gurus are modern legal alchemists. They promise gold, but their methods are principally intended to impress the gullible, or those who wish to use this drivel to abuse the court system. Any lack of legal success by the OPCA litigant is, of course, portrayed as a consequence of the customer's failure to properly understand and apply the guru's special knowledge. This applies directly to Banaman and what he promotes on his own channel. The arguments used by Banaman for auditing are not pseudo-legal in nature, let me just say that. They are just wrong, as I have just shown you in my detailed analysis and breakdown of those arguments. He's distorting the meaning of clearly worded statutory provisions, and he doesn't understand trespass. But he's getting the law wrong rather than inventing a whole new scheme of law, so it's not pseudo-legal. What we really need is a Meads and Mees judgment on auditing. Not because it is a pseudo-legal movement, it isn't in the main, but because it is a distinct niche that needs its own effective response from authority. We need YouTube, the police, the Crown Prosecution Service, the Information Commissioner's Office and the judiciary to get their act together and look at abusive auditing strategically as a distinct and discrete social phenomenon and develop the conceptual tools to deal with it within existing law. There's no need for any changes in the law. Existing law is more than adequate and the police could shut this down virtually overnight. Banaman is a pseudo-intellectual. He's spouting sophisticated-looking opinions without having an understanding of the topic, misquoting the law and misusing legal jargon in a way that will fool and lull many people who lack legal training. It's dangerous because it spreads confusion and illogicality, and it is causing harm to real people. The internet is full of these individuals. In the past, this was a type of person who used to walk around wearing a sandwich board or ran crackpot newsletters. The internet gave them a mass audience, and human nature being what it is, a lot of people find Banaman's verbosity convincing. When someone like me, who is knowledgeable, comes along, the same people often don't want to listen, because they're emotionally vested in what Banaman says, because they don't like authority, or they've suffered at the hands of authority, maybe lost their house at the hands of a bank or whatever, and they're unable to consider their own situation objectively. Instead, they seek salvation from crackpots, and of course the crackpots don't report the results to us.